Last year, I finished the majority of renovations on the lake house, inside as well as all the exterior outside, except for this deck. This deck is in really rough shape. There's a lot of rot. It was originally built in the early 90s. Some of it is redwood, but some of it is also green treated, and it's all been painted this brown. Well, I am ready to tear out the rot, replace what is needed, but try to salvage as much of the old growth redwood that's here. Restaining and refinishing this deck is going to be a big job made easier with my Wagner sprayer. Wagner is the sponsor of this video. I've used their Control Pro 170 sprayer for a multitude of projects, and I'm going to be applying a solid stain on this deck when all is said and done. But more on that later. Let's get back to how I built out the deck and repaired things first. The deck is only 14 inches off the ground at its highest point, so I decided to remove the railing. I really don't like how the railing obstructs the view of the lake from inside the house as well as when you're sitting on the deck, so I think that this deck would be better with just a long step across the front instead. Some of the railing posts had carriage bolts through them, so I had to remove the decking in order to access the back of that bolt, since the front of the carriage bolt had nothing for me to hold on to. I tried to loosen up that bolt from inside, and it was nearly impossible, even putting pressure on the front of the carriage bolt with a chisel. The bolt had started to rust, and it was sunk into wood that was partially rotted on the front, and so I had to also cut off the 4x4 post, chisel the remaining wood apart until I could access both ends of the bolt, use 2 locking pliers, and really muscle it apart. I had to do that process on 4 different posts, but the rest of the railing was so rotted it just fell apart with a push. I can't imagine that that was really keeping anybody safe from falling off of this deck. Now, when it came to refinishing the lumber that was already installed on the deck, I decided that I would sand it first to see what I was working with. But whenever I went around to sink screws in order to prevent them from hitting my sander, they continued to break off, and I realized that the majority of the screws in this decking were super rusted. Perhaps they didn't use exterior treated. When I was able to back them out all the way, I just replaced them with exterior treated decking screws. I went to my hardware rental place, and the guy there convinced me to get this super heavy duty floor sander. It just has a pad that sits on it, and then you put your big sheet of sandpaper down. The weight of the machine holds this in place. It's not grippy or anything. I think the machine weighs about 130 pounds, so I needed help getting it out onto the deck. But I was able to manage this by myself, steering it, running it across the decking to get the old finish off. Originally, I was thinking about getting a drum sander for floors, but the general rental guy convinced me of this one instead. He said this is also used for floors, and I can't remember what he called it. I think he said a finish sander. If you know the name of this machine, drop it in the comments below to help others out. The advantages for this is that it sands to the edge of whatever floor you're doing, and the pad handles the discrepancy in height between your deck boards a lot better than a drum sander would. So I did realize that a good portion of the decking was too rotted to salvage, so I'm going to pull it up and replace it with new green treated. I have to buy 2x6 green treated, so it's the same height as the part of the decking I'm keeping, but I think in the end it's all going to look pretty good. The worst rot was in the areas where this deck sees the most foot traffic, and I don't think that was by coincidence. Because so many of the screws had broken off in this area, I had to shear them with my angle grinder once the boards were up. For the decking that I'm salvaging and that I sanded for a new finish, I do have to deal with a little bit of rot along the ends. I devised the plan to just cut that off and add a decorative edge piece. So I measured that to 1.5 inch and cut it with my circular saw. This will be supported by the doubled up framing below. I think it's actually going to look really, really cool. The majority of my framing was in really good shape, but a few pieces had some rot, mostly from where those 4x4 posts came down. In researching building deck framing, the way that those 4x4 posts were cut is actually no longer recommended because it traps water and causes rot. I'm going to replace some of this with new 2x10 green treated boards to just make sure that my whole face of the deck is in good shape. Once all the framing is solid, I'm going to put joist tape along the tops of everything so that it protects it from rot. Next, I replaced all the rotted lumber with new 2x6 green treated. I cut these individually instead of snapping a line and running my circular saw like I did before, because I wanted to use the lumber as efficiently as possible. So whenever I cut one, I use the remnant for the next row. At this time, I'd like to invite you to follow me on my Instagram and TikTok channels. Here you'll see behind the scenes footage from these projects that I do, and if you love DIY home improvement, you will really enjoy following along. Along the edge, I added these trim pieces that compensated for the rotted ends I had to cut off from my salvaged decking. This trimmed out the whole deck beautifully, and I cut these on my table saw to be 1/8 of an inch shorter than the rest of the deck, so they're not going to get kicked off. I repurposed the wood that was from the railing I took down. It was still in good shape to cut out these trim pieces, so they're made of redwood. I'm repurposing more of the lumber that I took down to create framing for a big step across the whole front of the deck. So I built out boxes that had joists at 16 inches on center. And these big rectangles are going to create a step that is a little over 23 feet long. I removed sod from the area across the front of the deck where my step's going to go, and I also excavated a yard or so of dirt. I had to excavate in some areas and not others because the ground wasn't very level and I wanted the whole step to be level. So I dug down enough to accommodate for 2 inches of rock to be placed under the step as kind of a substrate. I leveled that out and stepped on it to tamp it, and then I placed my framing for my step. When I got the step framing level with a lot of adjustments to the rock underneath, I came in and pre-drilled the framing of the step through to the framing of the deck. I'm going to put 4-inch long leg screws to connect these framings together. If I were to do this again, I would have remembered to put a washer on my screw, and I wish I had done that for extra strength. To go over the existing cement path that's in the grass, I cut my framing like so. This is solid pieces of wood that I just jigsawed out a portion so that once I got everything level, it will go right over that cement path and look very intentional. Unfortunately, as I was digging for the rest of the step to go in, I ran into a sprinkler head that I didn't realize was there. So I excavated around the line and I learned something new on this project, how to cut off and replace a sprinkler head. I simply snipped the rubber tubing and then I heated up the end with a heat gun up to like 500 degrees until the rubber was malleable. Then I inserted a barb coupling, which has ridges to keep it in place as I reconnect the other side by heating that as well and sliding it over the coupling. Removing that length of tube, place my sprinkler head out of the way of my new step. That wasn't my only obstacle. I also dealt with large tree roots I cut out with my reciprocating saw, and I'm gonna bring my step all the way to the corner of this deck, so I had to remove some of the landscaping, logs, and rock as well. Working on this, hauling rock and excavating dirt, was really labor intensive, but it actually gives you a clue to my next project. I'm going to be doing something big with landscaping at my house, so be sure to subscribe to Welcome to the Woods so you don't miss it. Next, I covered my framing. Now it's all level and set with the new decking, but I have a question. I know that you're generally supposed to cup your boards down, and you can see that my first board is the right way, but then the next one is up. Well, this is because I didn't really have a choice. My decking had only one side that was good looking, and so I just placed the best looking side up. How much does this matter? Let me know in the comments below if this was a huge mistake. Once I was finally done with all of my building, I'm going to come and fix blemishes with Bondo. This 2-part putty is going to repair any other rotted areas that I didn't feel were needing replacing, as well as blemishes across boards or knots in the wood. I'm going to sand all of that smooth before blowing off the deck surface and preparing to apply my finish. Now, a lot of people say that with treated decking, you have to wait upwards of a year before you can finish it. But I have a moisture meter and I can test the moisture content in this lumber. If it reads below 15%, it's okay. You should do this even after pressure washing or heavy rains to make sure that you don't seal moisture into your wood. I'm gonna apply Behr's waterproofing stain and sealer in 1. This is a solid stain that has a 10-year warranty on decks. The trick is to apply 2 light coats, and that's made possible by my airless sprayer. The first thing I did was temporarily remove the edge pieces and coat my end grain with Refinish. This is going to seal it in and prevent it from rotting. Next, I went to spray the tops of the deck. Now you'll see on the left, there's a piece of cardboard there that I used to shield my siding so that overspray doesn't get on it and I can spray right up to the edge. Using my Wagner sprayer dramatically increased how quickly I could apply finish, but it is still best practice to backbrush so you can work the product into the wood grain and you can increase adhesion and durability. Another thing I really appreciated about using my Wagner sprayer is that it allowed me to get finish between the boards in that gap so much easier than if I was rolling. Would you believe me if I told you that including setup and cleanup of my sprayer, this entire deck took me only 4 hours? I spent a month prepping it and 1 day staining it. This sprayer is strong enough that I didn't need to thin my paint at all, even though solid stain is quite a thick product. And I loved that I had enough control. I hardly ever had drips, even on these vertical surfaces. If you're in the market for a great paint sprayer, be sure to shop Wagner by clicking the link in my bio. As a couple finishing touches for this deck makeover, I'm going to be painting this aluminum angle flashing. This is going to go along the foundation of the house where the deck meets it. There were some areas that were unsightly or gaps, and there was also some overspray from back when the house was yellow. I'm going to cover all of that up by painting the aluminum angle the same color as the deck and then gluing it into place. I also have to patch the holes where the old railing posts came down into the concrete. I'm using a mortar concrete mixture that is fast setting and works in applications up to 6 inches deep. Now the deck is finally done, and I love how beautiful it looks. I'm really proud of the design. Without that railing, it is just so inviting, and you get such a beautiful view sitting and relaxing on the deck, looking out at the lake. The before and after of this deck makeover is stunning, and I hope that it gave you hope. If you have a rotted deck in need of refinishing, that you can make yours look just as beautiful with a little hard work and maybe a Wagner sprayer. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment below, maybe hit subscribe with that notifications bell so that you can keep up with all my DIY home improvement projects. We'll catch you again next time on Welcome to the Woods.